Good afternoon. I am Heather McClure from the New Mexico History Museum. Let me start that again. There we go. But this is Edgar Lee Hewett. And I have been at the New Mexico History Museum for 6 years now. And this is an extremely complex man. We have been able, we are the home for his project. Whoops. We are the home for his papers and his photographic collections. And as you'll see me talk about today, the man was intricately involved in the culture and history and art and archaeology of New Mexico. All right, so this is Edgar Lee Hewett. And why are we making his records digitally available? He is originally from Illinois. He grew up mostly on a farm. He was a teacher and school superintendent who moved west when his wife Cora had tuberculosis. He started first at the Colorado Normal School. He was there from 1894 to 1898. And he started doing, while he was primarily a pedagogy education professor, he started to do amateur archaeology work on the Pajarito Plateau. He moved to Las Vegas, New Mexico to work at the New Mexico Normal School, where he was the president of the college. And he organized, while he was there, he organized the first college courses in the nation on American archaeology and continued his Pajarito Plateau fieldwork. Now, this started to take over his life to the point that the board for the college, he would take students out on fieldwork trips on the weekends, men and women, which was quite controversial. And the board started getting upset and asking him why he was taking students on so many picnics. So at that point, he decided archaeology was a better gig than being a college president. So he left education and committed himself to archaeology work in 1906. He was mentored by Adolphe Bandelier, and very, very important, he was mentored and funded and supported by Frank Springer, who was a politically connected New Mexico lawyer. He had worked on the Maxwell Land Grant in northern New Mexico. But Frank Springer was also a devoted amateur paleontologist. He specialized in Paleozoic crinoids. There is a large collection that he assembled sitting at the Smithsonian. And because of these many connections that Hewett made, including Frank Springer, Hewett got himself appointed Director of American Research by the Archaeological Institute of America, and he held this position until he died in 1946. Okay, this is Hewett in the center. He has a kerchief on and a white shirt, and this is at Gran Cuevera, now the Salinas National Monument. He started his archaeological career in 1906, and you could not stop this man after 1906. For the next 40 years, he founded and led the School of American Archaeology, now known as the School for Advanced Research. He did work that led to the preservation and establishment of what we now know as Bandelier National Monument, Chaco Canyon National Historic Park, and Mesa Verde National Park. He drafted the report that was absolutely intrinsic for the passing of the Antiquities Act in 1906. He worked with Iowa Congressman John Lacey. He founded the Museum of New Mexico, still today located in the Palace of the Governors, which he also led from 1909 until his death. He renovated and restored the Museum of New Mexico, the Palace of the Governors, from about 1909 to 1913. He worked on several projects in San Diego. He started the college archaeology department there. He started the Museum of Man, which is now known as the Museum of Us. And he served as the director of exhibits of science and art at the Panama, California Exposition in San Diego that ran in 1915. He founded the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of New Mexico. He did field work in Guatemala, Mexico, Spain, India, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, the Sahara, and what was then known as Palestine, Arabia, and Mesopotamia. I could go on. I could go on for a while, but he did all of these things, but make no mistake, it wasn't him alone. It took a lot of people to get done what he got done. And either inadvertently or on purpose, by delegating as much as he did, he left behind two legacies. The correspondence from his many far-flung projects, international, national, as I mentioned, make up the great majority of this archival collection. And the people he assigned to these projects went on to become the archaeologists, museum curators, and scholars who came to define New Mexico culture and Southwestern archaeology in the early 20th century. This is a little bit of personal information. This is Hewett with his second wife, Donizetta. His first wife, Cora, died from tuberculosis in 1905. And this is Donizetta and Edgar standing in front of their home, which is now part of the museum, New Mexico Museum of Art on Lincoln Avenue in Santa Fe. And she was quite a pip too. She was a suffragette. She went out into the field with him, as did Cora, and was also involved with the 15 Club, which is a sort of elite ladies literary society at the time. He was married twice, as I mentioned. He had no children. His nickname was El Toro, the bull, as in stubborn as a. So when he wasn't doing all the things that I already listed or out in the field, he loved to get into feuds with people. He got into feuds with Bronson Cutting, who was the editor and publisher of the Santa Fe New Mexican, L. Bradford Prince and the New Mexico Historical Society, other anthropologists, artists that he encouraged to come to New Mexico because he didn't like the way they were doing art, the Santa Fe Chamber of Commerce, the Indian Arts Fund. I could go on. Those were kind of the big ones. So. And this is also Edgar Lee Hewett. And I would give my eye teeth to find out what is going on in this photograph. There are 65,000 pages in this collection, documents in this collection. So I know somewhere in there is a work order for, we need one elevated chair for Dr. Hewett at Puerto San Jose, Guatemala. So it's in there, but I haven't found it yet. So, all right. So all of this work that we're doing to digitize his papers is courtesy of the National Historical Publications and Review Commission, which is the funding arm of the National Archives. And I am the project manager, in addition to being a librarian and archivist at Chavez Library at the New Mexico History Museum, on our project, increasing public access to the treasures of Edgar L. Hewett's American Southwest. Now, we submitted, this project came about, let me just say, the Hewett collection is the most used collection at Chavez Library. When we were preparing the grant, I estimated that in 1 month, I believe it was July 2021, 40% of our research time, people coming into research, was spent using the Hewett collection. So we had concerns about the use of the collection. As you know, paper can be fragile, especially 100-plus-year-old paper, but also there is clearly a need and a desire to look at this collection. We wanted to make this as accessible as possible. So we submitted our grant application in October of 2021, and then we waited. And you wait a while when you write grants. In May 2022, we got the go-ahead, hooray! And then we said, oh Lord, now we have to do it. So, we were one of only 15 grants that was awarded to make historic records publicly accessible. And so this is amazing. So what have we done with this grant? We have hired 2 archivists, and one worked primarily on the documents. She digitized 29 linear feet of documents. And just to give people a good concept, a linear foot in an archive is a banker box. So it is based on the amount of space it takes on the shelf. So that is 1 linear foot. So imagine 29 of those boxes full to the brim. And that is what has been digitized. So we also hired a photo archivist who organized and digitized. We got to outsource the digitization of about 2,300 images for the Hewett collection. And this was vital, as I mentioned, to the preservation of this collection. So, and then currently in process, and by this fall, these materials will be available through a digital asset management system hosted by the New Mexico History Museum. From the comfort of your own home, you will get to look at all of the photos from around the world, from all his Southwest work, and also all of the documents will be available. So, and you can look at them at your leisure 24 hours a day. Fantastic. So this will take until about fall of 2024, and then the world will have access to this amazing collection. Okay, so let's set the stage a little bit. The territory of New Mexico, this is a map from Chavez Library on the right. Early 20th century New Mexico was a heady place. Passenger service started into the state in 1879, and with that came increased tourism, a changing demographic with a growing Anglo population amongst established Hispanic and Native American communities, and the growth of an artist community, primarily in Santa Fe and Taos. And New Mexico received territorial status in 1850, but did not receive statehood until 1912. Establishing the Southwest's cultural uniqueness and importance was absolutely necessary in the long path towards statehood. New Mexico power brokers needed to counter arguments like those from Indiana Senator Albert J. Beveridge, who wrote in a 1902 congressional report on New Mexico's potential statehood, "The committee hopes and believes that this mass of people, unlike us in race, language, and social customs, will finally come to form a creditable portion of American citizenship." So this is what they're working against. Part of New Mexico's self-promotional effort was the establishment of institutions like the Historical Society of New Mexico and like the Museum of New Mexico to collect, preserve, and build early interpretations of New Mexico culture and history. And archaeology played a part in that campaign. The brochure from the State Land Office, this is courtesy of New Mexico State University's special collections. I appreciate them sharing that. But as you see, they're talking about health seekers, tourists, and archaeologists. They specifically mention that as a draw to the state. So modern archaeology had been practiced since about the 12th century, but more current methods such as site work, stratigraphy, object preservation and analysis over perhaps plunder, let us say, that had been practiced by Napoleon, like the obelisk sitting in the middle of Paris right now. Those were more current site preservation techniques were 19th century techniques. American archaeology work was only in its infancy at sites like Cahokia in Missouri. And the highest profile work at this time period was at sites like Hisarlik, which was ancient Troy. And that work was done by Heinrich Schliemann. Also, work was being done in Europe by Frank Calvert, Wilhelm Dorpfeld, Karl Blegen, all varying degrees of trained and amateur archaeologists. The Archaeological Institute of America was founded in 1879, and the AIA provided support for its first archaeological excavation when it assisted Adolph Bandelier with his work in Mexico and in the Southwest of the United States. There was archaeological fieldwork happening in the late 19th century in New Mexico. One of the most prominent examples was the Hyde expedition in 1896 at Chaco Canyon, and that was funded and directed by the American Museum of Natural History. And into this culturally fertile environment arrives Edgar Lee Hewett. If you were involved, as I have hopefully started to let you know, if you were involved with any culture work in northern New Mexico in the early 20th century, especially artistic, historical, or archaeological, you crossed paths with this man, whether you liked it or not. as I mentioned, he was a teacher. He was a research institute founder. He was a museum director. He was a field school director. A lot of people cross paths with him. Hewett took up archaeology during a transition when the profession moved from pot hunting to a specialized scientific field. And he was heavily influenced by John Wesley Powell and William Henry Holmes at the Bureau of American Ethnology at the Smithsonian Institution. And they had a focus on Native American acculturation and capturing ethnological information that they considered disappearing. So this was Hewett's mentors. And Hewett's first publication for the School of American Archaeology, he writes, in American archaeology, man in the cultural process is the unit of investigation. Hewett put a strong emphasis on field work and invested a great amount of energy into the summer field schools in New Mexico. And as I mentioned, the field schools, men and women did archaeological work. This was seen as controversial, scandalous at the time. And this field work fed Hewett's great interest in collecting materials and putting them in museums. He eschewed standard archaeological practices such as stratigraphy, readily adopted by his students in their subsequent work. And this rejection of standard research techniques would not only put him in conflict with academic archaeologists like Columbia University's Franz Boas, but would also cause his methods to be rejected as old-fashioned later in his career. I ran across a letter where someone was quite frank about saying that he was not an archaeologist, he was a politician. And having now worked with his papers, I have to agree wholeheartedly with that description. So, but it worked. So, all right. One of his first major successes was at Mesa Verde, 4,000 archaeological sites. There was a brisk trade happening in relics from the site. In fact, there were businesses local in Animas City, Myers and West Livery, feed and sale stables, who advertised that they would furnish complete outfits, including tents, camp equipage, etc., for persons desiring to visit the far-famed Aztec ruins on the lower Animas or the cliff dwellings at Rio Mancos. So this was another tourist site too. But Hewett joined forces with a local organization, the Colorado Cliff Dwellers Association, and worked especially closely with two of the powerhouse women who were involved in that, Virginia Donahue McClure and Lucy Peabody, to preserve the site. Now, I have a note here about Gustav Nordenskjöld. He came and did archaeological work and then packed everything up, put it on a train, and it is currently at the National Museum of Finland in Helsinki. And this was the fate of many sites around the Southwest, and this is what Hewett was trying to prevent. So he wrote a report called Memorandum Concerning the Historic and Prehistoric Ruins of Arizona. And in the lower corner, the sort of wider paper is one of the copies of the report that we have in the archival collection. And there's Hewett inside one of the rooms at Mesa Verde, and there is the government declaration, congressional declaration of Mesa Verde as a national park. So he rode around for 2 weeks with Iowa Congressman John F. Lacey, and it was Hewett's report that was absolutely essential for the writing of the Antiquities Act, which passed in 1906. And it was the first United States law to provide protection of any general kind for cultural or natural resources, and it established the historic preservation policy for the United States. All right, I wanted to talk about that there was a huge difference between archaeological permits pre-Antiquities Act and post-Antiquities Act. The one that is titled Department of Interior at the top, that is from William A. Richards, who is the General Land Office Commissioner to all the public land agents in this region. And just a reminder, the General Land Office was the precursor to the Bureau of Land Management. Now, please note that this is still a transaction between archaeologists and the government. We do not have tribal input at this point. So, okay, in 1905, the one with the red letterhead, instructions were sent by Mr. Richards to these land agents that they were not to interfere with Hewett's archaeological work in Santa Fe, Rio Arriba, and Sandoval counties. Those three counties, just a reminder, encompass 11,521 square miles, a little bit smaller than Belgium. And to just say he can run free in those areas. In 1907, different process. Under the aegis of the Archaeological Institute of America, Edgar Lee Hewett has requested permission to excavate and gather objects of antiquity at the Pueblo ruins about 10 miles west of the town of Espanola, New Mexico, on the Santa Clara Indian Reservation, and the permit was granted August 6, 1907. Okay, so hold these permit images in your mind. We'll come back to those in a moment. Okay. I'm mentioning a lot of things that Hewett was going on because I want to keep emphasizing all of these things were happening at the same time. So hence all the correspondence back and forth, back and forth. So it was long desired to have a museum in Santa Fe. A December 1880 column of the Santa Fe New Mexican proclaimed, "Indeed, the entire country is interested in the history of New Mexico, and Santa Fe being the capital of the territory and its oldest city, it is eminently proper that there should be a historical society here." So in 1901, Governor Miguel Otero's plan to deal with the palace's upkeep, and let me also say the palace, I've done some research on the palace. It has been constantly in need of upkeep pretty much from the second the first adobe brick was laid. In fact, the New Mexico History Museum just finished some excellent work on that regarding electrical, HVAC. We're keeping the palace alive and going for more time, another 400 years, hopefully. So, so Governor Miguel Otero's plan was to deal with the palace upkeep was for the Smithsonian to take over. And the territorial legislature put together a joint resolution in March of 1901 requesting that a museum be established and the Smithsonian run it. So the resolution goes to the Smithsonian board, and Governor Otero thinks this is a done deal because Theodore Roosevelt, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, is on the Smithsonian board, and they knew each other from the Rough Rider years. So he's like, this is done and done. Okay. So it was also, this proposition was supported by John Wesley Powell from the Bureau of American Archaeology. And Powell was known as being quite politically canny. So this seemed like having his support was going to be a good step forward. Okay, so things moved leisurely in Washington, D.C. at this time period during the summer. And the regents really did not meet frequently. So the resolution's in, they say, okay, well, January 1902 at the earliest, we'll give you a resolution. And this was a promise of action, even if it was kind of far out. And that was great until September 6, 1901, on a trip to Buffalo when President William McKinley was shot twice in the abdomen and then died 8 days later of a gangrenous wound. Okay, Theodore Roosevelt is now president. He's off the Smithsonian board. Okay. So no more inside person there. And that was that. February 1902, Governor Otero receives a letter from the Smithsonian board saying they resolved that it was impracticable to accept the proposal of the territory. Okay, so there goes that plan. This is where Hewett comes in. By 1907, you know, these proposals were happening in 1902. 5 years later, the palace is not in better shape. And at that time, the remaining tenants were Governor George Curry, who was actually slated to move to a new governor's mansion, the Historical Society of New Mexico. They had been there since 1885, a post office, a lawyer's office, and an alfalfa field. So tight quarters. Same year, the territorial government grants space for 2 museums in the palace, so long as the same is conducted in harmony with the management of the Museum of New Mexico herein established and for free public use. Harmony was hard to achieve. So $5,000 annual appropriation. Okay, so 1907, the palace is in tough shape. Hewett shows up, proposes using it as a new educational center for the Archaeological Institute of America, comes with money to redo the palace. This was approved by the acting governor, Nathan Jaffa, in 1909, with the caveat that the palace needed to be renovated and altered to align with the Spanish architecture of the period. And a museum was established at the same time, and Hewett automatically becomes the director of the Museum of New Mexico and is also the director of the School of American Archaeology. Same time, same building. The palace is absolutely intrinsic to his work. It was where everything came from. So, and this also aligned with his goal of having a museum to store the materials that had been found on SAA's fields work and field schools. And he wanted to keep it from being shipped elsewhere, as he had seen at Mesa Verde. So he was the director of the Museum of New Mexico and the School of American Archaeology until his death. The first field school, Southeastern Utah, 3 students, 1907. And it was actually 3 very important students who would be working with Hewett for pretty much the rest of his life. Okay. And this is one of the new images. This is from the Hewett materials that were digitized. I have a combination of images that I'm drawing from, some from Jesse Nussbaum, I'll talk about in a second, some from other sources that will be new and digitally available. And this is from a field school, 1927 at Walatoa, otherwise known as Jemez Pueblo. So. And this is the palace after the renovation. And I know that, I don't quite know the exact date, but I'm pretty sure it was after the renovation because the sort of the towers, they were called. One of the most fascinating people I have run into working with these documents is Jesse Nussbaum, and he worked with Hewett over and over and over again. And he was the construction project manager for the palace renovation, while also doing about 3 other jobs too. But he was extremely fond of the towers on the end, was kind of the large doorway and windows. And he was absolutely adamant that that happened, that would be put in place. So this is an acetate negative. So, okay. So Hewett, as I mentioned, relentless promoter of himself, of archaeology, of the state of New Mexico. And he had this opportunity. He became the director of exhibits. He was called in because of his role as a leader of the School of American Archaeology to be the director of exhibits. And they had already decided to do a sort of heavy ethnology focus on during this exposition. And the nation was exposition mad at this point. There were several happening in conjunction with the Panama Canal opening. The Panama Pacific Exposition was happening in San Francisco. This is the Panama California Exposition. Same time, about 1915. And so Hewett was the director of exhibits. The building was designed by, as I mentioned, William Morris Rapp, Isaac Hamilton. It is, if you're familiar with the New Mexico Museum of Art, very similar construction. They are both meant to look like the church at Acoma Pueblo. So, Hewett, once again, took this moment to sort of highlight, emphasize Native American cultures again, for the role of showing that they were not disappearing, which seemed to be a philosophy at the time. There were 7 tribes in Pueblo artisans. They spent their days in the Indian Arts Building, weaving, silversmithing, making pots for exposition attendees. And again, while this was all of these projects were happening, he also was doing field work at Quiragua in Guatemala. And this is following up on work from Alfred Maudsley. the jungle was encompassing the stele. So there was a lot of work done to sort of clear out the jungle and do some work on documenting structures and things like that. So all of this international work he spent 3 seasons in Guatemala and wrote about it for the School of American Archaeology. And as I mentioned, this was all happening while he was technically still the director of the exhibits, the director of the Museum of New Mexico, the School of American Archaeology. All of this was happening at the same time, and he would leave these people behind. So, and it was people were starting to mimic him. Jesse Nussbaum, who took these photographs, was technically still the production manager at the palace while he was in Guatemala taking all these photographs. So, and Nussbaum is endlessly fascinating. He was a great photographer. He was amazing at construction. He was an archaeologist, and I have come to learn that he was incredibly important in road and highway archaeology. He actually was one of the first people to do this, which is now, I know, a big work of not only this office, but multiple departments of transportation all around the country. So, however, just because Nussbaum worked with Hewett, it was not always the happiest relationship. And so while Nussbaum was working to restore the Palace of the Governors, he described working with Hewett like this. He wanted things done fast, you do it, and then he would leave for the Near East, Athens, or Rome, and then casually take credit for your work. So, okay. So let me just say that the permitting structures that were happening, courtesy of national work, United States work, Hewett was also trying to do this with international work. This is from the Mexican Secretary of State. And you'll notice in there about 4 lines down, you'll notice that there's about 5 cajas, 5 boxes of antiquities. What exactly was in these 5 boxes of antiquities, I haven't the faintest idea. That is not in the documentation so far. But at least he had a note that he was taking away 5 boxes of antiquities. So somebody has a record of it. So. Okay, so I wanted to go back to New Mexico archaeology a little bit. And this drawing is from Karl Lotov, who was at the site and also did several murals that are in the palace right now. Those might be a little more fanciful. Apparently his field sketches is a little bit more appropriate. So think back to the permit I mentioned earlier. He was doing work at Puye Cliff Dwellings at Capo Owenge, also known as Santa Clara Pueblo. Now Hewett had a plan, and he had U.S. government permission, and he was ready to move forward on his work at Puye Cliffs. But what did the people of Capo Owenge think about this? So Hewett did engage in some early attempts at tribal consultation, but as you'll see in a moment, it might have been more an example of what not to do. Having read several documents from OAS, I'm becoming familiar with modern archaeology reports, but here is a sample of Hewett's writing from his 1908 essay, Excavation at Puye in 1907, just to give you sort of his voice. At first, determined opposition to the excavation of the ruins at Puye was offered by the Indians from the nearest Tewa village, Santa Clara, 10 miles away in the Rio Grande Valley, on whose reservation the site is located. The governor, headmen, and representatives of the cacique, or religious rulers, were met in council, and the whole matter frankly laid before them. It was explained to them that this was our way of studying the history of the Indian tribes, that we believe that the thoughts and works of their ancestors and of the other people with whom they had been in contact constituted a noble record worthy of being recovered and preserved for all time. Some appeal was made to their sense of gratitude for assistance rendered them in the past in securing from the government a much needed and justly deserved extension of their reservation, and laws releasing them from the payment of taxes on their lands, which at one time had threatened the extinction of the title to their homes. Bare reference was made to the fact that under the permit of the Department of the Interior, we were acting entirely within our rights in making excavations on their reservation, for it was desired to rely mostly upon their higher sentiments in the matter. I greatly regret that I am unable to reproduce the speeches of the head men on this subject. They abounded in incisive and cogent argument, which demanded unequivocal and logical answer. On the whole, their contention was on a high plane, and their deliberation marked by much lofty sentiment. It ended in all objection being withdrawn and most cordial relations established, which were afterward expressed in perfectly friendly attitude toward and interest in our work. Okay, so these tense relations continued during Hewett's subsequent work at Puyi in 1910, 1916, 1927, and his patronizing attitude was not uncommon. A letter to Hewett, this is the typed letter there, a letter to Hewett from Indian agent, former Indian school superintendent, and Santa Clara Pueblo resident Clara True from 1930s uses the same tone, but because it is a private letter, less polite terms.
Yeah, there I noticed that you used the word redskins.
Yes.
I haven't seen that word for a long time.
It jumps out. So I've discussed a lot of documents, but please note that Hewett's images will be, they're digitized and they will be available too through our digital asset management system. And they contain materials from his work and trips to Southwest, Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, Iraq, and Egypt. And this is just a small sample. These were two from Puyi cliff dwelling work. And the top image, these are both panorama prints. The top image, it's a little faint, but it's a double exposure. You can kind of see a row of people in the back. So. Okay, so as I mentioned, his documents and his images reside at the New Mexico History Museum in Santa Fe at the Fray Angelico Chavez History Library and the Palace of the Governor's Photo Archives. And thanks to this grant, we have digitized his entire archival collection and we're making it available through global online access. This is a sample of our New Mexico History Museum digital collections, and this is going to be the portal for looking for Hewett. Plus, there will be not only the 65,000 documents and the 2,300 images from Hewett. In addition, there will be thousands of other documents and photographs from other Southwestern collections, and the digital archive will keep growing. While this digital collection will dramatically increase access, it also serves as a form of preservation, allowing museum staff to limit physical access to such delicate forms as nitrate negatives from the photographic collection, while opening up intellectual access. And I keep mentioning, I think I've possibly mentioned nitrate negatives in particular a few times. That form is quite volatile. It can self-combust if held in the wrong environmental conditions. So the images have been digitized, and then the negatives will be packed away in freezer boxes for safe storage. Cool and dry is the way to hold nitrate negatives. So once we do that, there will be more information, less explosions. So, okay, and I wanted to finish up with Hewett in a nutshell. This was a postcard in the collection. I love this postcard. As you see, so there's Hewett in two of the pieces from his, I can only presume, three-piece suit with his fedora there, surrounded by students. And there he is, orating, as usual, in at a field school. And if you look at the text, I don't know if you can read it, but the text of the postcard says, "The big boss tells the story." And as you notice, it was sent to Hewett. So this is what is endlessly fascinating to me, that people seem to, especially women, I am very intrigued by this. He has a very complicated relationship with women. Sarah Rounsville, our document archivist, did some great research on the women in the collection. And Hewett did elevate their careers. He provided them these opportunities. He also paid them terrible. And incredibly important women like Bertha Dutton, who held the Hewett papers and were responsible for them coming to the museum, and had her own really amazing career in archaeology and museums. She had been the director of the Wheelwright Museum. He insisted that she be a curator and be his secretary at the same time because she did such a great job. So this man is incredibly complex. So I love this postcard. This just really seems like Hewett in a nutshell to me. So I've touched on a few threads in this dense and informative collection, but the New Mexico History Museum wants you to see these materials, to read the voices that built Southwestern archaeology, and to engage with these legacies. And I want to say thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming this afternoon, and I'm happy to answer any questions. So